Do we or do we not have free will? This has been a question that's plagued both me and society as a whole for quite a while. And while I obviously don't have a concrete answer for you all, my various rabbit holes in search of an answer have led me to a lot of really interesting lenses of viewing the world through. One of these lenses, and one that's really stuck with me, is this idea called determinism, and a specific niche within determinism called ecological determinism. Throughout the length of this video, I hope to go through ecological determinism with you all and show you how our world is, at the very least, heavily influenced by, or maybe even controlled by, the natural forces around us, with a really specific focus on the civilizations that we live in and how those civilizations emerge, how they interact with each other, and how they succeed in differential ways.
Prologue. What is ecological determinism? I wanted to add this section because I personally get really annoyed when so-called intellectuals just throw around terminology and expect us to learn it as a second language. It's exhausting and honestly makes me too mad at them half the time to properly focus on what they're trying to say. Basically, ecological or environmental or climatic determinism, it's a flexible term, is a special form of determinism, the idea that our world is causal, with the past strictly dictating how the present unfolds and the present strictly dictating how the future unfolds. A one-to-one correlation between prior events, present events, and future events. Essentially, determinism removes the effect of randomness from how we view the world. Instead, things follow each other chronologically like a movie without plot holes. Ecological determinism thus specifies that this cause-effect relationship is caused by ecological elements, particularly as they pertain to how civilizations develop, and thus assigning the control of our societies to nature itself instead of the free will of the individual human beings in said societies. I mentioned that it's a flexible term because I specifically mean ecological determinism, with an emphasis on ecology, as for me ecology represents the sharpest mental net for natural factors, with it encompassing all things outside of the human mind, but still immediate to the aspects of the environment humans interact with, and is thus more accurate than other definitions like environmental, biological, or climatic determinism. Now, before I dive in, I want to preface with two things. Firstly, I want to specify that while making this video, I've very actively tried avoiding the more popularly discussed effects of the physical world on civilization. There's already so much media out there on how Russia was limited by its lack of open ocean-facing warm water ports, or how diseases like smallpox were crucial in the European colonization of the Americas. So I don't feel right about speaking on such subjects, as there's not really much I'd have to add to the popular discussion about them. I'm also just kind of sick of hearing these same talking points. There's only so many times you can mention how vital rivers were for trade before it gets redundant and annoying. Secondly, I think with any topics involving the human experience, it is necessary to add a disclaimer. While I would hope your guys' takeaway from this video is that the people of different societies are not better or worse than each other for whatever metric you use to gauge good and bad, and that instead their predicaments are largely a product of factors out of our control, and maybe even that said predicaments don't necessarily have to imply deeper truths about the societies, I do not want this video to have a political tilt of any kind. And so I actively tried to not direct the narrative of this video in any particular way. This does not necessarily mean I will not make more politically oriented videos in the future. I just think the subjects covered in this video are really fascinating and can stand on their own meaning on philosophical and scientific grounds without further convolution. Moreover, I want Zaydan to be more informational than anything, a place for the Renaissance man, the general intellectual, to reemerge in modern society. And such desires necessarily include a level of impartiality. Oh, and one last quick note. I tried to make the different sections of this video as disjoint as possible so that they can be enjoyed separate of each other. I know this is a long video and certain subtopics may interest you more than others, so I've tried to break it up into as many independently digestible segments as possible. Part 1. Civilization's Origins. By far the oldest attested archaeological sites, and thus sites displaying the first traces of civilization, are found in the Fertile Crescent region of the Middle East, and the gap is not even close. The Middle East precedes other agricultural nuclei by thousands of years, with many other civilizations deriving their ignition into existence from Middle Eastern societies via trade and interaction. This presents two rather pressing dilemmas. The first pertains to the timing of agriculture globally. You see, while there is a clear geographic winner in terms of where agriculture first arose, the civilizational nuclei are well within an order of magnitude of each other when you consider the history of humanity as a whole. More precisely, agriculture abruptly began in the last 5% of human history, a comparatively very short window for multiple agricultural societies to independently arise in. The word independently is important here and can be confirmed by tracing prehistoric global trade, as said trade would indicate the exchange of ideas between people who could describe various components of civilization to each other. While we do have evidence of said trade in ancient times, we do not have evidence of the dead giveaway of agriculture reaching places like China from the Middle East. Wheat, with China itself not gaining wheat until several thousand years after its agricultural revolution. Other societies are even more evidently detached. Take, for example, the Mesoamericans. We have zero reason to suspect any trade occurred between the Middle East and Mesoamerica at any time in pre-Columbian history, let alone 5,000 years ago. There is marginal evidence of interaction between Siberian and Polar American hunter-gatherer tribes within this time frame, but it would be exceptionally unlikely for agriculture to somehow bridge the gap between the Middle East and Mesoamerica through the vector of northern hunter-gatherer tribes, since those tribes don't practice agriculture themselves. And again, we lack any evidence like traded plants, seeds, or tools. The second pressing question is, why did agriculture, and thus civilization, arise in the Middle East first out of all places, particularly when the vast majority of the region is harsh and arid desert, with the actual area that agriculture began in, the so-called Fertile Crescent, being not that fertile in the first place, having quickly depleted soils and often requiring tedious irrigation canals to plant crops, whereas other areas such as sub-Saharan Africa or northern India seem far more apt for agriculture's early development. Moreover, the first farmers and the first towns they inhabited weren't in the more hospitable river valleys of the Fertile Crescent. They were in the upland, hilly regions of the Levant, where irrigation was far harder and the mountain terrain more difficult to farm in. This topic also holds massive importance to ideas of cultural or civilizational superiority. If the Middle East is such a mediocre place for agriculture, why did agriculture start there? Are its inhabitants uniquely hardworking or innovative? What then does that mean for its stagnation in modern times, or for the meteoric rise of Western civilization? Moreover, the oldest traceable language family in the world is Afro-Asiatic, the family dominant in and around the Middle East and containing languages such as Arabic, the Berber/Amazigh dialects, or even ancient Egyptian. I specifically say oldest traceable because linguistic traceability largely comes down to how much written content we have in the language. And due to how uniquely old the Middle East civilizations are, we have written content going back very far. In fact, the first manuscripts from Egypt date back to roughly the time frame we can trace the origin of the Indo-European languages back to, the languages spanning half the world and some of its most powerful societies. These questions about the Middle East's preeminence thus pose immense importance to nationalists both in and out of the Middle East, and cultural supremacists outside of the Middle East have especially had difficulty grasping the dissonance between the early emergence of civilization here and the superiority of their civilization, which emerged later and not here. And while I'm not coming out in support of Burkina Faso supremacy or anything of the like, it seems quite likely that the earliness of the Middle East in adopting agriculture and civilization largely comes down to environmental factors, not cultural ones or anything exemplary about its people. Famous anthropologist Jared Diamond attempted to address this in his infamous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. While his book is often more renowned for his explanation of why Western society thrived where others didn't, I would argue his points on why civilization began in the Middle East are even more profound. He brought down the issue to one largely of an abundance of domesticatable organisms in the Middle East, specifically an abundance of domesticatable seed plants and animals. For animals, Diamond argues that only a minority of species are actually domesticatable, since a lot of traits have to be present in them, like a proper speed of maturation and reproduction, a natural hierarchy in their social structure, and easily sustained diets. There are many species held in captivity today not containing these criterion, like with the ostrich regularly being farmed in countries like Egypt, and in fact, many Christian monasteries in Egypt farm ostriches as a chief source of income. But we cannot expect a hunter-gatherer society to have the same technology, resource availability, or even just desire to collect animals for enlightenment purposes, as do the people of the 21st century. I would add something to the criterion: size. Without large domesticatable animals, megafauna, it's really hard to attain caloric surpluses from meat, as smaller domestics like rabbits really only provide a meal or two worth of food, and since they reproduce so abundantly in the wild, it's not really worth the effort of trying to domesticate them unless you have other animals that provide the bulk of your meat supply. The biggest benefit, then, for a society is for there to be as many megafauna present as possible, so that the chances of a few of them being worth the effort of domestication increases. The Middle East is gifted in this regard, being the birthplace of the domestic cow, pig, sheep, and goat, among others, with those four species alone representing the majority of human meat consumption for most of human history. But why, specifically, did the Middle East have so many large species worth domesticating? Diamond argues that the answer largely boils down to how long animal species have been in contact with humans and their evolutionary siblings, like Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo denisova, etc. This duration of contact is longest in Eurasia and Africa, where we have concrete evidence of both modern humans and older species like Neanderthals going back hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Essentially, human tool innovation has been breathtakingly slow for the vast majority of human history, and the further back you go, the more primitive tools get, naturally. So the species that have had the longest time to co-evolve alongside of us have had the best luck in staving off overhunting from us and our technologies, be it by evolving to be more fleety, aggressive, or elusive. Animals who aren't used to humans, on the other hand, have no evolutionary programming to fear us, and so become really easy targets for overhunting. This likely explains why the Americas had so few domesticated animals prior to European contact. The native animal species of the New World had not encountered humans at all before roughly 15,000 years ago when the first ones came. And so these animals were docile and oblivious, and thus quite easy for early indigenous peoples to hunt to extinction. This surplus of nutritious meat caused the native populations to explode while it lasted, as the original founding population of the Americas was only a few hundred, but had ballooned to multiple millions within a few thousand years. We even see evidence for this in the large animals that did survive the peopling of the Americas. In his book Ecological Imperialism, Alfred Crosby mentions that big game like bison or elk that survived here pretty much all have very close relatives in the Old World, like the elk being distributed on both sides of the Bering Land Bridge, or the American bison having its European bison counterpart. These species either had recent migrations that pushed human-fearing genes into their New World populations, or were lucky enough to be from a species that had naturally human-opposing traits. This last part, human-opposing traits, may be the reason that the cassowaries of Papua New Guinea both survived and remained undomesticated. Large cassowaries weigh about as much as the average sheep, and so they definitely hold enough meat to be worth domesticating. And it's not that the natives of Papua New Guinea didn't try either, as we have evidence of them attempting to tame cassowaries by stealing their eggs and attempting to raise them in captivity from over 18,000 years ago. However, the bird is just a complete nightmare to deal with, being extremely aggressive, fast, and carrying literal knives on its feet, 5-inch talons that can rip through human abdomens. Thus, it's entirely possible some creatures just got lucky by being one of God's monstrosities. However, humans have been present in New Guinea for over 60,000 years, over 3 times as long as they have been present in the Americas. So it's possible that even there, the animals like the cassowary co-evolved alongside humanity from an early enough time for them to survive. New Guinea was actually a really promising contender for cultivating one of the earliest civilizations, featuring some of the most densely populated regions in the world in the pre-modern era, as its highlands have incredibly fertile volcanic soil and year-round temperate, warm, and predictable weather. The lack of livestock really hindered it and left its inhabitants often protein deficient. This protein deficiency is thought to be why cannibalism was so common in New Guinea, and why cannibalism maintains its last global vestiges in some of New Guinea's most remote tribes. It's important to note that the opposite situation, animals having too much time to co-evolve alongside of us, makes the situation equally difficult. This is what is thought to have happened in sub-Saharan Africa. Humanity emerged from Africa's grasslands, so the animals there have had by far the longest time to get to know us, and specifically get to know how to defend against our attacks. Even in the modern day, Africa maintains by far the highest concentration and diversity of megafauna in the world, and the fauna's head start in resisting prehistoric human hunters is likely the biggest reason why. But so without many domesticatable fauna, Sub-Saharan African, Native American, and New Guinean societies were left at a massive disadvantage, whereas the Middle East's surplus of such species propelled it forward, giving it an early caloric surplus for society to be built with. But that is only one half of Diamond's argument, and in fact only one half of the domestication story. Plants remain a big mystery. Luckily for the Middle East, however, its ecology excels in this category as well. For this, we return to the initial question of how could the Middle East centers of agriculture, the not-so-humid hilly areas of the Levant and southern Anatolia, be the place where society began if they are so unimportant for later agriculture as in the modern day, as compared to river valleys and wetter regions of the globe, which hold immense agricultural importance now and have held such importance for thousands of years. This question is somewhat faulty, however, as while those areas are not the best for agriculture per se, they are the best for producing species of plants that are most useful to domesticate and plant intensively. You see, the areas of the Middle East where agriculture began experience a special climate, the hot summer type Mediterranean climate. Like its name implies, this climate range is known for its hot, very dry summers and relatively cool winters ranging from moderately wet to near monsoon conditions. Fall and spring in this climate range tend to either be a gradual gradient between summer and winter or experience a sudden shift, usually in October and May. Antakya, Turkey is a good exemplar of this climate type, with its summers being quite dry and its winters experiencing near monsoon level rains. This climate, especially since these areas tend to experience very little frost in the winter, produces immense blooms in the spring to take advantage of the warm and wet conditions, blooms that dry out by the end of the summer as their roots cannot grow fast enough to extend deep into the soil to reach water trapped there, whereas the surface soil dries out in the Mediterranean sun. This cyclic climate thus favors annual plants that produce dry seeds by the fall, which happen to be perfect for humans to collect, store, and turn into crops. Wheat and pulses, which are essentially things like beans, prospered in this climate and produced multiple varieties here that humans ended up exploiting. The Middle East was further blessed in the higher nutritional value of its staple crops as compared to other regions, as the ancient wheat varieties of the Middle East, for example, contain almost double the protein amount per gram as compared to the ancient rice varieties of China. Also, this higher nutritional value might have been due to there being more annual plant species here in the first place. So the first farmers might have implicitly selected the most nutritional varieties, and then those communities fared better and took over the Middle East, whereas the communities that selected the less nutritious crops did not fare as well and were outcompeted. The ones with the more nutritious crops fared quite well, in fact, and with their millennia-long head start to the civilization game, these areas quickly became some of the most densely populated in the world. Finally, the relatively small plot of arable land in the Middle East may have actually been beneficial for encouraging agriculture to start there, because it forced hunter-gatherers to become farmers, which is something they seem to not really want to do. For this last point, it is hard for us to see such a concept considering we are so far removed from our prehistoric past, but Hunter-gatherers had much higher quality of lives than their agrarian counterparts, with hunter-gatherers having much better diets, healthier bodies, tighter-knit tribes, and even working fewer hours per week. Agriculture was not great for its followers, but it entrapped them in its existence because farming produces large excess food stores, stores that resulted in more food available year-round for more mouths to feed. But those mouths would starve if they went back to hunter-gatherer times because agriculture supports a much higher population density than hunting and gathering can. Simply put, agriculture allows us to near totally exploit the environment around us, whereas hunting and gathering forces us to be another niche in ecology and thus does not allow us to take full advantage of the environment's energy potential. In fact, in the book The Future Eaters, author Tim Flannery mentions that hunter-gatherers usually only utilize 20 to 30% of the resources that they can, mainly because they have no defense against a resource-poor season since they don't have large food stores. The resource-poor seasons would reduce their populations if they exceeded this 20 to 30% threshold, since if your population is using 100% of the resources of a good season and you encounter a bad season that only produces 30% of a good season's resources, your population would shrink back down to 30% of the good season's resource amounts. And it would take much longer to recover than shrink since humans take so long to reproduce and mature. But yeah, this resource exploitative existence effectively trapped communities in agriculture once they established themselves within it. I've heard the comparison multiple times now between this trap into agriculture and the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. While I do think some of the claims of how great life supposedly was for humans when we were hunter-gatherers are a little exaggerated, it would make a lot of sense if the forbidden fruit was actually a metaphor for the fruit of our labor, agriculture. I will talk more about how ecology shapes religion later in the video, but for now it's not hard to see how prehistoric tales about the hardships of farming could slowly transform over the generations into biblical tales about the fall of mankind. As for why this trap happened in the Middle East before other places, it seems that again we can look to the unique climactic setup of the Middle East. For some background, in all places where agriculture first arose, it is likely that the agrarians and the hunter-gatherers were in constant competition, with the hunter-gatherers raiding the agrarian settlements where they could. In areas that were still low in population density, this would have made it really difficult for agriculture to be sustainable, as the less healthy agrarians would have had to stave off attacks from the well-fed, evasive hunter-gatherers, and did not yet have the population momentum to vastly outnumber the hunter-gatherers. It is likely then that the first farming communities took a while to establish themselves, slowly growing against the resistance from hunter-gatherers. The Middle East seems to expedite this slow growth through two phenomena. Firstly, its Paleolithic inhabitants got an incredible boost from post-Ice Age climate change. Right after the last Ice Age, the world experienced the Balling-Alarod interstadial period, which raised temperatures globally and made the climate in the Middle East more wet and humid. I mentioned that the seasonal dryness of the Mediterranean climate was a boost for the development of the Middle East's plants that would later become humanity's first crops, but once those crop plants became established, the wetter conditions likely led to these species flourishing and also expanded the area of the Levant that had such crops growing wild. This led to the first sedentary communities in the Middle East, and the entire world in fact, evidenced by the existence of the Natufians. The Natufians were able to maintain sedentary hunter-gatherer communities, which were unique in the hunter-gatherer history of humanity, as rarely were wild plants that nutritious that human populations could be that dense, especially since technology had not yet reached a point of advancement for all of those nutrients to be efficiently extracted. Thus, the first phenomenon is this. It seems that in the Middle East, humanity encountered abundant enough edible wild plants to settle down into sedentary communities before starting to farm. We really don't have much evidence for this happening elsewhere in the world, with most evidence pointing to sedentary life and agriculture happening simultaneously. I should be careful saying this though, as this topic is like the anthropology version of the chicken and the egg debate, with scholars still quite conflicted on whether sedentary life or agriculture occurred first generally. Regardless, in the Middle East's case, it seems like its early inhabitants got a lucky boost from how bountiful for humans the environment there was. As an aside, and like I previously mentioned, this edible plant abundance seemed to come at the right time in humanity's technological progress as well, since people had advanced enough tools to process the staple crops of the Middle East into readily accessible calories. In fact, we have evidence that this technology was advanced enough that the Natufians were already making bread and beer. Crazy when you realize these people were alive 15,000 years ago. But back to my main point. This increased climactic wetness actually likely boosted both nomadic and sedentary hunter-gatherer population densities, as yes, the wild cereal and pulse crops were more abundant, but so were the prey animals that dined on them. So while humanity was able to settle down here first, we were one, still all hunter-gatherers, and two, the sedentary hunter-gatherers still had to compete with the nomadic ones, paralleling agrarian hunter-gatherer competition later in history. Something else was needed to catalyze agriculture from this warming period. Serendipitously, this catalyst came rather quickly, with the globe shifting into the Younger Dryas period, where global temperatures lowered and the Middle East dried up once again. This event reduced the amount of land available for both nomadic and sedentary hunter-gatherers to exploit, with wild cereal crops being especially affected by the change. Yet, right before this period, human populations here were growing quickly, so now you have a bunch of people left with too few resources to survive only hunting and gathering. This forced the sedentary hunter-gatherers to begin cultivating the plants they once were able to forage, while forcing the remaining nomadic hunter-gatherers in the Middle East to either settle down or go extinct, both expediting agricultural development in the Middle East and removing its competition from hunter-gatherers. The inverse of this agricultural pressure may also help to explain why other areas that thrived later on stalled in developing agriculture, most notably Europe. Europe experienced a large increase of usable land after the last ice age as compared to the contraction of usable land we saw in the Middle East, which could have had the opposite effect and stalled Europe's agricultural developments by reducing the pressure on its hunter-gatherers. So with that, it seems we have finally addressed the dilemma of just why agriculture and civilization first arose in the Middle East specifically. Yay! As for the other question, why agriculture independently arose in roughly the same time frame across the world, Alfred Crosby once again makes a rather thought-provoking point in his book Ecological Imperialism. He mentioned that, with the peopling of the Americas, humanity had largely conquered the globe and stood at its edge, yearning for something more. It had hunted Earth's biggest game to where they were not as abundant nor diverse anymore, but it was still hungry. I am paraphrasing, but his wording was largely in this poetic sort of tone. But it contained a pretty analytical truth. Humanity was relatively interconnected before the peopling of the Americas, and trade occurred globally to where human cultures were generally on the same level of technological advancement. We advanced enough to hunt the big game and grow our global population, but we got to a point where the game were too few for that to keep sustaining our growth. No one wants to go hungry, and so humanity, for the most part armed with similarly advanced tools globally, relatively simultaneously crossed the technological leap that is agriculture. Now that we have produced our embers of civilization, we can look to see how ecology affected those civilizations' trajectories. With that, we start Part 2, Ecology and Success. I was originally going to make this two separate parts, why civilizations fail and why civilizations succeed, but I realized any coherent point I will make will necessarily include a comparison between these opposing cases. So instead, I have decided to combine this into one segment and go through specific examples. 2.1. Civilizations and weather. Immediately into the subject of civilizational success, we see a clear weather-based pattern. Colder climates tend to fare far better economically than warmer weather ones. In particular, societies in the temperate climate zones tend to far outcompete societies in the tropical zones of the globe, with temperate climates producing the strongest, most robust economies. In fact, these temperate zones encompass all four major economic powerhouses: the US, China, Russia, and the European Union. This cold weather supremacy is perhaps the biggest question in both modern anthropology and modern macroeconomics. So, why do cold weather countries consistently outperform warmer nations? It gets even more curious when you realize the differences are even among relatively small geographic distances and gradients, as in some places like the US, Italy, or Spain, places a few dozen miles and a few degrees different in average annual temperature can have tremendous economic and social differences. The disparity thus isn't just between tropical and temperate places, it is between hotter and colder places, even ones relatively similar by global standards. Before we dive into this, I want to add that while it may seem that Germany inverts this pattern, as southern Germany is wealthier than northern Germany, north and south here are misleading, as northern Germany is actually warmer than southern Germany on average. This strangely flipped weather pattern comes down to two factors, the most obvious being geography, and more specifically, topography, the study of elevation. Southern Germany is much higher in elevation than northern Germany, cooling it. The second, and more nuanced factor, are global currents, particularly the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is its own beast to cover and was historically considered important enough to receive the nickname Europe's central heating. It pushes warm water currents from the Gulf of Mexico to the northern Atlantic, heating the continent's Atlantic-adjacent portions. In the past, it was attributed as the main reason agriculture in Europe is possible in places as far north as northern Norway, whereas in the Americas, crop growth barely extends beyond the latitudes of continental Europe. But the modern consensus treats the warmer conditions of Western Europe as also due to the westerlies, winds that transport warm air northeast from the Americas to Europe. This combination of warm air and water currents allowed Europe to sustain agrarian societies at far higher latitudes than anywhere else, giving us unique places like Tromsø, Norway, which has trees and farms like any other human-populated place, but also 2 months of total darkness in the winter, or the anomaly that brought us to the aside in the first place, northern Germany being warmer than southern Germany. And one additional point on Germany: the confusion between northern and southern Germany's climates may also arise from the fact that northern Germans tend to be paler, blonder, and lighter-eyed than southern Germans. These are traits we tend to implicitly associate with colder places, but these traits more so depend on UV exposure than temperature. UV exposure is unavoidably lower in a higher latitude place of the same cloud patterns, which block out sunlight and a large amount of UV intensity, as its lower latitude counterpart. Germany has roughly the same climate throughout, so its northern portions receive less UV exposure and thus have paler, blonder, and more blue-eyed people on average. One final point on this though: Germanic north-south differences are actually really nuanced, since while the South Germanics produced a lot of technological/micro innovators like a majority of the German car brands or Swiss watchmakers, the northern populations seem to have more philosophical/macro innovators like Gauss or Martin Luther. The reasons why are really interesting, and I'm sure I'll make a separate video explaining them soon enough, but for now we will just consider climactic factors in the general case. But also, North and South Germanic lands are both pretty cold/non-tropical by global metrics, so the global pattern still holds even if warmer Germanic areas decisively did better. So great, we've identified that this phenomenon of colder places tending to be more successful does in fact exist, and we've hammered down some fun examples, but we've yet to answer just exactly why this phenomenon exists. For that I had to do some digging. It turns out Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University also noticed this phenomenon and covered it quite well in his 2020 book, The Ages of Globalization. He called the latitudes that most often contain these temperate zones the lucky latitudes, and argued that temperate climate societies tended to fare better not out of advantages on their end, but from the disadvantages beseeched to tropical societies by their climate. His argument boils down to two main hindrances for tropical climates. Firstly, the high prevalence of disease, and secondly, fatigue. For the disease aspect, it may be most pertinent to correct one of my earlier statements. I mentioned that Africa's animals are simply too aggressive and good at evading us. And while this definitely applies to species like the insanely dangerous Cape buffalo or the hyper elusive okapi, this statement is not universally true. Certain antelope species like the eland are both docile and fit Jared Diamond's other criterion for domestication. And in fact, a global eland domestication effort is actively going on. So why didn't this occur already in Africa? Why instead is the eland just another safari creature? Well, sub-Saharan Africa was one of the most disease-ridden places historically on the planet, and remains a hotbed of infectious and dangerous diseases with many barely understood even by doctors today. There are two things causing this. Firstly, humanity originated in Africa, so the environment here has evolved alongside us over these past multiple millions of years, and so it has figured out quite a few ways to harm us. We previously mentioned that this made the animals here harder for us to hunt, but it has also made the viruses and parasites here more acclimatized to our bodies. This heavily hinders the development of any dense settlements, as such settlements would immediately be pillaged by multitudes of disease. And these diseases don't just infect us. Trypanosomiasis, also known as sleeping sickness, originated in Africa and has historically ravaged livestock populations, especially cattle. These diseases are often found in tropical climates, and sub-Saharan Africa is unfortunately almost entirely tropical, so virtually all of its farmable lands have massive disease potential. As for the second reason for the lack of livestock in pre-modern Africa, Sachs identifies a climactic factor. The year-round warm weather provided zero stumbling blocks for diseases to propagate through populations. In other places, the isolations of winter provided an effective quarantine against diseases spreading too quickly or too widely, whereas here there wasn't really a way to simulate such a quarantine. This lack of winter made it effectively impossible to house herds of animals in enclosed spaces, as the diseases would quickly infect whole regions of livestock and spread through the individual herds even quicker. Foreign livestock didn't do any better. In fact, one of the chief drivers of the transatlantic slave trade was the desperate demand for horses by various African leaders. They needed horses for war, but horses had a ridiculously high mortality rate in sub-Saharan Africa. So African leaders had to constantly purchase horses from Europeans and in return supply them with slaves and raw materials. With this stumbling block of disease, alongside the previous argument of how hard to domesticate most of the animals here were, sub-Saharan Africa was left with many pockets of hunter-gatherers even into the modern era, and with no strong civilizations, sub-Saharan Africa was quickly conquered by multiple foreign, namely European and Muslim, societies. These colonial pursuits were partially hindered by how inhospitable the environment was to foreigners in certain regions, though, with Africa often being referred to as the white man's grave. In fact, European colonialism in its most tropical regions was not really possible until the invention of the anti-malarial drug quinine, which, as Jeffrey Sachs mentions, was often infused into gin and tonic. Thus, gin and tonic can be added to the list of drinks used to conquer societies, alongside horse milk vis-a-vis the Mongols, and water vis-a-vis the Mongols and also everyone else. An interesting point to make is that this doesn't necessarily mean sub-Saharan Africans didn't try to form an agricultural civilization earlier. It just means that whatever attempts were made were very quickly beaten back by the environment and existed for too short of a time and in too large of a potential area for us to find conclusive evidence of such communities. The inverse may also be the reason we have so much archaeological material from the Fertile Crescent. It's a comparatively very small area of land, and so it's not like looking for a needle in the haystack, like in sub-Saharan Africa. So that was the disease argument. As for the fatigue portion of why tropical societies tend to underperform temperate ones, the explanation is relatively simple. In tropical climates, it is often just too hot to do labor-intensive activities. While humans have a remarkably effective cooling system, sweating, even we can overheat and quickly tire out in super hot climates, particularly if they exhibit high levels of humidity. This may help explain why, for instance, pre-modern farms in tropical areas tend to be much smaller than farms in temperate areas. In the temperate areas of the world, you could exert a lot more effort before tiring out. Such large farms provided a greater surplus to their owners, leaving temperate societies more able to accumulate individual wealth. The counter-argument would be that in tropical areas you can usually plant and harvest multiple crops a year, up to 4 crops in some areas, whereas in temperate areas you usually only have enough warm weather for a single harvest. But even then, that wouldn't really make up for the 10 to 20 times size difference we see between farms in temperate areas and farms in tropical areas. I've experienced this heat-driven demotivation personally, as I consistently find it much harder to do work in the hotter periods of the academic semester, even with air conditioning, as for one, many of the residential halls at Princeton aren't air-conditioned, so you often wake up in a miserable sweat, and even if it is pleasant inside, walking around for 20 minutes in hot weather mellows you out rather quickly. In fact, I tried to work on this video outside, but found myself quickly irritable and unable to think about dumb cassowaries in Papua New Guinea or whatever. And that is comparatively very light work. I couldn't imagine doing hard agricultural labor all day for multiple months on end in such weather. In the cooler climates of the world, the hottest days are a small minority of the year, and also not even that hot compared to the tropical regions. So manual labor outside is slightly less miserable and more tolerable. On the topic of Papua New Guinea, I should note that tropical climates weren't necessarily the main hindrance here, as the New Guinean highlands, which historically contained most of New Guinea's population, are high enough in elevation to be temperate and not tropical in climate, despite their location so close to the equator. They did, however, hinder how far agrarian societies could extend into New Guinea, as they were largely confined to these highland regions where farming was worth it. So we've seen how disparity in the success of societies can arise from the disadvantages of tropical climates. I would argue, however, that the disparity is not just due to these disadvantages. There are unique advantages to cold climates that situate them well in the competition of civilizational success. For one, humans are physically designed for tropical climates. We may see variation here and there, but the human body struggles physically in any weather that isn't at least warm. In fact, the shivering point, which is the temperature at which a fully unclothed human being starts shivering if left exposed indefinitely, of the average human is a mere 77 degrees Fahrenheit. I know it's hard for us to remember this since most of us aren't walking around naked all the time, but humans without technology cannot survive outside of hot regions. This aspect, technology, is perhaps why cold regions tend to do so well. You simply need to innovate there or else you die. You need to figure out ways of making thick, insulative clothing, ways of stitching that clothing together, ways of foraging in the dead months of the year, winter, and ways of consistently maintaining fire and patterns of livestock based around the highly contrasting seasons. This is also something I've somewhat experienced personally. One of the benefits of going to college in the Northeast, in my eyes, is how it forces you to confront bitter cold daily for months on end. Every winter on campus, I find myself furious at the wind for existing, and it's not hard to see how that discomfort and desire to contain the cold would be magnified 2 or 3 times over in pre-modern times, before central heating and most people working indoor jobs. I would also add that the changing seasons add a temporal factor to life. It is hard to romanticize summer if every day feels like it, and so the existence of seasons might boost creativity by giving life more flavor to base said creativity on. A stronger sensation of life being fleeting, and thus requiring you to make the most of it and write more poems about how you're sad that life is fleeting. Moreover, harsh winters specifically give an incredible opportunity for free time for pre-modern societies. You spend the rest of the year stocking up and preparing for a season without crops or huge opportunities for income, which in turn gives you a whole season of time to think and create in. We have some tangential evidence for this through the existence of bimodal sleep patterns in pre-modern Europe, i.e., where people would wake up halfway through the long winter nights, read and do some chores for a couple of hours, and then go back to sleep. Finally, and this is quite anecdotal, but the happiest and most carefree people I know at my school are all Floridians. Some of them have mentioned this to me, that they think Northerners grind too hard because we had to figure out a way to drive ourselves not crazy during the miserable winters. Our bodies like vitamin D and do not like to shiver, but pleasant conditions also seem to breed complacency in many examples. I, for one, grew up in Pittsburgh and can honestly be quite a depressive person, but I also like to think of myself as someone at least trying to be a high achiever. It may help to elaborate on this with yet another anecdote. I've noticed my hardest working friends are pretty much all the ones that used to be overweight when they were younger and have lost weight since. Cold climates philosophically work similarly to being naturally unlucky with your metabolism. When the universe is working against you, you either have to fight back twice as hard or fail. Both my now skinny friends and the societies that survived the cold succeeded and thus put in this extra effort. Along the way, these friends gained a ridiculous work ethic, and honestly, a lot of them put me to shame, and I could very well see how we could interpolate such a work ethic to cold-hardy societies. Interestingly enough, however, it seems modern technology has made both advantages somewhat arbitrary, with central heating and weight loss medications reducing the needed human effort for the same end product as before. This more cold climate advantageous explanation may also help to better explain the smaller differences we noticed earlier. Sure, tropical climates being inhospitable to civilizations helps us address why equatorial countries fare worse than temperate countries on average, but it does little to explain smaller geographic differences like northern versus southern Italy or the United States. Unique advantages to cold environments help fill in this gap. I should be clear, however, that there is a limit to the benefits of cold climates. Polar and montane areas do not have long or warm enough summers to permit reliable agriculture and were thus unable to sustain strong and prosperous societies for the vast majority of human history. Obviously, this changes with modern complexities, like the oil boom in Norway or tourism to Iceland, but up until the last century or so, these possibilities for polar societies simply did not exist. There then seems to be a climactic Goldilocks zone for civilizational success. Again, we pay homage to the lucky latitudes that Jeff Sachs mentions, which are roughly the regions between 25 and 45 degrees away from the equator in either direction. This point also implicitly summarizes the mobility of ideas across different geographic realms. In Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond famously coined the continental axis hypothesis, which says that because places with similar latitudes tend to have similar climates, whereas longitude drastically changes climate, areas that are more longitudinal than latitudinal tend to have a hard time with trade and expanding across their territory. Such a disadvantage to a landmass with north-south orientation helps explain why we saw so little trade between societies in the pre-Columbian Americas. As, for example, we have no evidence of direct contact between the two major civilizations there, the Incas and the Mesoamerican societies, and such lack of trade and contact likely resulted in less innovation in the New World. 2.2. Environmental energy and success, or lands of plenty. A related idea to temperature is ecological energy. In The Future Eaters, Tim Flannery delineates the world through high and low energy ecological regions, written mainly to underline the uniquenesses of Australia's physical characteristics, particularly in how they relate to the history of its Aboriginal communities. It was actually the second book I read about Australian ecology in preparation for this video, the first being Ecology and Empire by Tom Griffiths and Libby Robin. I have to say, I am really glad the song Down Under was trending this summer, as it got me in the mood for thinking about Australia for days at a time. I wouldn't be surprised if it pops up in my most played songs on Apple Music at the end of the year. But back to ecological energy. As we will shortly see, this energy definition the book Ecology and Empire outlines proves to be crucial to understanding how these uniquenesses shaped Australia's Aboriginal past. While temperature was useful to us earlier in understanding general trends, Australia is a rather unique case and thus requires a more systematic consideration of its predicament. This new frame of understanding ecological differences, ecological energy, fulfills this systematic consideration and is thus more wide-spanning than just temperature, incorporating soil science, geology, precipitation, and ecological scale into the mixture. This next talking point may be sensitive today, but up until somewhere in the last 20 years, Aboriginals were widely renowned as some of the most primitive pre-European contact groups on the planet. Before European colonization, they had rudimentary tools, were almost entirely nomadic with no built-up settlements, and had no agriculture at all. And in fact, Australia was the last major landmass where agriculture was absent. The explanations of such delayed development used to usually just blame the Aboriginals themselves for being weak-willed or something else containing similar levels of contempt. Approaching the matter from an environmental lens turns out to be a little more forgiving, revealing a few major factors working against the success potential of the Aboriginals. We can start building this energy-based explanation from the ground up, literally, by analyzing Australia's soils. Earlier in the video, when we were talking about where agriculture started and why, I mentioned that New Guinea had a huge boost in having fertile volcanic soils. The word volcanic here is quite important, as volcanism is one of the three chief drivers of soil fertility in the long term, with the others being tectonic plate movements and glaciation events, with volcanism filling the earth with metals and minerals that are both useful and necessary for the successful growth and propagation of plants. Over time, these metals and minerals leach away from the land into the sea and require further volcanic activity to replenish. Australia was unlucky as a place of very little volcanic activity over the last few tens of millions of years, leaving it without a natural mechanism to revive its soils with, and thus leaving Australian soils rather depleted and poor in nutrients. As for the other two chief drivers of soil fertility, Australia has been in the temperate and tropical zone for millions of years, exhibiting extremely little glacial activity in the process. Additionally, Australia has been tectonically relatively stable in that same time span, further limiting its soil fertility potential. In turn, Australia has some of the most depleted soils in the world, featuring very low concentrations of vital substances for vegetation like phosphates. These poor soils made Australia's plant life less lush and thus less available to be exploited by both humans and animals that humans can hunt. Moreover, Australia is a mostly arid continent and one extremely influenced by the El Niño Southern Oscillation effects. These effects bring sporadic and severe droughts to the continent, ones that even modern Australian farming communities struggle mitigating the effects of. Both of these climatic influences, a lack of rain and unpredictable droughts, destroyed the Aboriginals' chances of agriculture by destroying the possibility of both sides of agriculture, animal domestication and crop yields. For animal domestication, Flannery mentions that the pre-Aboriginal megafauna of Australia, i.e. the animals that lived in Australia prior to humans coming there, were about 30% smaller than the pre-human megafauna in other parts of the world, leaving Aboriginals with both fewer large species to try and domesticate, and the ones that were not as large and thus not as useful as their Eurasian counterparts. Moreover, koalas are dumb, as in literally dumb, and they're not the only ones. Australia is filled with an unusually high number of reptile species, particularly reptilian carnivores, with reptiles being relatively unintelligent animals. This may be because the Australian environment is just so resource poor that the species here can't spend much energy on their brain, which means that the megafauna here may have been pretty slow-witted and thus easier for humans to hunt to extinction. For crop yields, there's just no way to plan for the volatility of El Niño. The droughts come at unpredictable times and stay for unpredictable intervals, leaving potential Australian farmers at constant risk of famine with no safety net. Sure, you can try to store grain for bad years, but when you can't reasonably predict those bad years, and when those bad years can be multiple bad years in a row, there's not really a way for you to succeed at farming. So, like in sub-Saharan Africa, early Aboriginals could have very well attempted agriculture, but their attempts wouldn't have lasted long. Thus, Australia is a rather severe case of a low-energy environment. There are some upsides, though. Both the natural environment and the Aboriginals had remarkably complex webs of coexistence with each other, with Aboriginal Australians having some of the most peaceful societies found anywhere. Their lack of resources, particularly in the El Niño drought years, meant that they had to rely on the mercy of others and promised to reciprocate said mercy, making pre-European Australia one of the few places in the world where peace was actually more lucrative than war. Interestingly enough, Australia's epistemological cousin, New Zealand, encountered the exact opposite issue. When New Zealand's first inhabitants, the Maori, came to the archipelago in the mid-1300s, they encountered perhaps the closest thing to paradise attainable, a lush, fertile oasis filled to the brim with animals that had never encountered human beings, nor had encountered any human-sized predators, and thus had no ingrained fear of us. With such an abundance of easy-to-hunt wild game, the Maori quickly abandoned raising the pigs and chickens that they brought with them. We have evidence of such a surplus resulting in other populations across the world temporarily abandoning agricultural practices as well. In fact, this even managed to happen in the now advanced Western Europe, where a post-Ice Age increase of sea mammal populations resulted in Western Europeans temporarily abandoning agriculture. The difference here is Western Europeans had other nearby populations to regain agriculture from once their surplus ran out, whereas New Zealand's Maori were left isolated without a way to regain their long-lost domesticated pig and chicken populations. With all the native megafauna extinct and no domestic fauna, New Zealand went from paradise to horror in less than 300 years, with the Maori resorting to routine cannibalism to attain protein, an extreme war-prone society over the minimal natural resources, widespread ecological destruction to try to grow measly crops of sweet potato, and even going as far as constructing elaborate fortresses to protect their meager harvests of sweet potato from enemy tribes. Note that the Maori's fellow Polynesians and cultural siblings, the Easter Islanders, experienced a similar surplus but maintained their agriculture throughout it, keeping their domesticated chickens. These chickens may have been the primary reason that the Easter Islanders did not engage in cannibalism, or at least not widespread cannibalism, while the Maori did. The Easter Islanders just had a reliable protein source. It's not that the Easter Islanders didn't stumble upon a lush virgin land full of potential for their excesses to develop in, either. The Rapa Nui were so well off for a time that they were able to expend enormous resources into constructing their famous and numerous Easter Island heads. By the time Europeans contacted them, however, they had overexploited their island so much that they were described living in a sad surf-like condition. So, what gives? Why did the Maori lose their pigs and chickens while the Easter Islanders kept theirs? Well, the main differentiating factor between Easter Island and New Zealand is size. A small settler society could very easily unite the entirety of the relatively small Easter Island under its helm, keeping the situation controlled enough that raising chickens was worth it, and it wasn't just a competition of which tribe could exploit the land the quickest. New Zealand did not have this luxury, being an awkward size where it would be really hard for any pre-modern civilization to unite its entire lands under its helm, but also too small to have sparsely populated areas of land where maybe a few of its megafauna could have survived. In terms of civilizational success, then, the size of the inhabitable landmass is also very crucial. In addition to landmass size, there seems to be a healthy Goldilocks zone of energy as well, similar to how we had a Goldilocks zone of temperature. Civilizations do not prosper in low-energy environments where farming presents very little reward, but they also don't do well in these super high-energy environments, only possible if the fauna of the environment aren't used to people and thus are easy to drive to extinction, leaving the civilization without animals to domesticate. This last point may also help to explain the lag in New World societies. Take, for example, the wheel. Mesoamericans did develop it, but used it very trivially for children's toys. Without large animals to pull heavy carts, the Mesoamericans simply had no use for wheels. Sure, humans could pull carts as well, but that isn't really useful as the average human can't pull all that much weight, and thus without beasts of burden, trade networks with heavy loads of goods became unfeasible. Thus, the New World was so high energy initially that it actually became a hindrance for the long-term success of its first civilizations, as the people of these civilizations were able to take so much advantage of the energy in their environments that they were able to extinct multiple species that could have been useful to them later. This, in combination with the limitations of the north-south orientation of the New World that we discussed in part 2.2, hugely set back New World civilizations like the Mesoamericans or the Incas. 2.3. Russia. I wanted to give Russia its own segment partially because the nation honestly holds a lot of cultural importance for me as someone who grew up in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but also because its case is such an interesting one geographically. I mean, it's by far the largest country in the world, connected to all major economic regions by a land border or a short boat ride, has more arable land than China, yet has a smaller population than Bangladesh, and for much of its history was brutally poor and considered backwater. The key question then is why? In the introduction, I briefly mentioned that a lot of theories have already been proposed about how the economic underdevelopment of Russia is due to how it is too landlocked to have naval trade to its avail, with that supposedly being the main hindrance. But even if naval trade were its main hindrance, that question further asks why it simply couldn't overpower any nearby naval nations in the first place and take over their waters, especially much smaller states like Sweden or Norway. I would argue that this, as well as Russia's other hindrances, are largely due to how indefensible Russian land was for the vast majority of its history, and how that indefensibility shaped Russia's society and culture. In the 7 Ages of Globalization, Jeffrey Sachs pinned much of this lack of development in Russia on how long and cold its winters are, leaving a fairly short growing season which left crop yields rather low and highly sensitive to annual weather fluctuations. With such low crop yields, it's quite difficult to produce large enough food surpluses to feed urban populations, and the effect was rather stark. By 1800, only roughly 2% of Russians lived in cities, whereas roughly 20% of Western Europeans did, a 10x difference. This was exacerbated by how spread out the Russian populace was. In such low-yield croplands, each peasant community needed more land to produce enough food to sustain itself, spreading the Russian population thinner. These two characteristics, a low population density and a very low urbanization rate, stalled Russia's success by hindering its industrialization and limiting its exchange of ideas and its ability to school its populace. Moreover, when you did see growth, ethnic Russians were often not behind it themselves. The Russian nobility famously were very Western-facing, with many going to Western Europe to attain an education, Peter the Great famously loving the Germans and the Dutch, and certain Russian leaders, even the Empress Catherine the Great, being of entirely German descent. The Western hegemony over Russia happened internally as well, however, with many of the industries, intellectual fields, and government sectors in the country being dominated by non-Russians. In particular, ethnic Germans living in the territory of the Russian Empire, particularly the Baltic Germans, batted far above what their population would indicate in Russia. I actually took a class on Russian history this past semester and decided to write my final paper on Russian Germans. It was honestly one of my least favorite classes I've ever taken, and I didn't even do that well in it, but the insight on Russia it provided me was worth the trudge. Anyways, for the final paper, I found this table in the book The Volga Germans by Fred Koch, showing the percentage of Russian ministry positions filled by ethnic Germans. And it's crazy to think that these were only one of the multiple Western groups that were well established in Russia and still alone were the majority or plurality of many fields. But to be clear, it's not like the Russians are unintelligent. In fact, some of the top chemists, physicists, and literary figures have come from Russian backgrounds. Moreover, while it's true that Russia has a lot of cold and unproductive terrain, it, and even more so the former Russian Empire/Soviet Union, also has a ton of fertile land, particularly in its Chernozem region, which remains one of the top wheat and cereal growing regions in the world today. I think, like I hinted at earlier, the cold is not the only ecological factor in consideration. Russia also has the unfortunate predicament of being the border region between agricultural lands and the vast Eurasian steppe, home to a multitude of extremely successful horse warrior cultures. These horse warriors, the Mongols being the most obvious example, left an indelible mark on Russia both immediately and in second-level effects. On the immediate end, many post-Mongol Russian noblemen were of Mongol descent themselves, and in fact a lot of the early Russian political doctrines were heavily influenced by the doctrines of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols, while incredible warriors, did not have great policies for the long-term governance of settled groups, and so Russia was already set behind. Even after establishing itself, Russia was plagued for centuries by nomadic slave raiders and ravagers, like the Nogais or the Crimean Tatars, who enslaved millions of Slavic Christians in their 3 centuries of rule from the 1400s to the mid-1700s. These long-term and devastating ravages left the Russian populace, especially its political figures and nobility, rather anxious about Russia's physical insecurity and desperate to advance the country to make it more capable of defending its territories. I've already mentioned how Russian leaders, particularly Peter the Great, were frequently Western-facing to educate their nobility for the advancement of Russia. But to actually attain the advancements that these noblemen were educated in, they had to put in an incredible amount of manpower, particularly into infrastructure projects. Predictably, these projects were often overly ambitious, like how Peter the Great's Azov project required a full 1% of Russia's working populace, with many forced to work in it by conscription. And due to how rushed these projects often were, they left their workers in often miserable conditions, with many choosing to just abandon their posts and run off to the rural parts of Russia where they could get away from the state due to how weak the state's central control was. Centuries of this disappointment in the pace of Russian advancement and in the disloyalty of its brutally poor population led the Russian state to become rather harsh on its own people, with it using them even more to fill in what gaps Russia's technological primitiveness left in its system. This led to the brutal and repressive serf system of Russia, with serfs often treated worse than slaves elsewhere in the world. One of the craziest instances of this to me were the burlaks, who were serfs hired to pull river barges because Russia had devalued its human capital so much that it was just simply cheaper to use a bunch of beleaguered serfs to pull a boat than a few horses like elsewhere in the world. The Russian nobility also often just simply despised its commoners to a greater extent than anywhere else in the world, with Catherine the Great's nakaz codifying some rather absurd ideology about peasants, like how only 2 to 3% of them should be allowed to learn to read and write because education somehow turns commoners evil. These brutalities, both of the nomadic kind and of the state-enforced kind, coupled with the geographically enforced poverty of Russia, left its population as a whole rather militaristic and its peasant population increasingly embittered as industrialization brought better workers' rights elsewhere in the world. This ultimately led to the implosion of the Russian system via the Russian Revolution, but the vast majority of the early Soviet Union's population had already lived most of their lives under crushing poverty and as devalued peasants, so the Soviet leaders were able to reinstate a system of civilian repression rather quickly. Part 3. Horses. Before I begin, I wanted to say that for this section, I found a very fresh book titled The Horse, A Galloping History of Humanity by Timothy C. Winegard. It was just released in July of 2024, so it contains some of the most up-to-date historiographical information out there on horses. I wanted to include a section specifically about horses as opposed to any other animals because, and as we will see, horses are definitively the most important species we've domesticated. It's hard to remember this with the modern popular image of the horse largely boiling down to wealthy bookish girls with abnormally strong legs or closeted cowboys in Wyoming, but horses were the chief war machines for over 5,000 years of human history. Like we saw in the Russia section, horses allowed rather small nomadic groups, who spent their whole lives learning how to properly utilize horses, a massive advantage, enabling them to conquer and ravage far more populous territories with far more advanced cultures. The advantages did not just extend to nomads, however, as the Spaniards who first conquered the New World managed to defeat native armies hundreds of times their size on horseback, aided by the pure shock and demoralization most of the native warriors had at seeing such large and powerful animals. Moreover, armies were entirely reliant on horses and mules for both fast communication and military supply lines, and so by the time horses had become domesticated, they were already indispensable to a successful army. For these immense advantages, societies went through remarkable efforts in trying to both acquire and breed healthy horses. We briefly mentioned an example of this in part 2.1, where we stated that horses magnified the transatlantic slave trade by quickly becoming a much-needed resource for wars between African kingdoms. But African societies were nowhere near the only ones putting in such high levels of effort for horses. Very few people in Western societies eat horse meat, and while that may just seem like a baseless taboo, it has a rather deep legal basis. Multiple times throughout Western history, both various Western states and the Catholic Church itself have banned the consumption of horse meat, partially for its association with pagan horse meat rituals, but also for just how useful horses are. Eating them would reduce the number available for war and transport, so many states had a huge incentive to discourage the horse meat trade. China similarly realized the immense importance of horses thousands of years ago. Various Chinese emperors poured in immense resources into trying to expand China's horse stock in an attempt to fight off the nomadic horse peoples that would routinely invade and ravage China. In fact, Feizi, the founder of the state of Qin, which would later become the Qin dynasty that first united China, was given his noble status as a reward by the king of the Zhou dynasty at the time for being a good military horse tamer and trainer all the way back in the 9th century BC. Yet the Mongols conquered China in the 1200s AD, and the last dynasty of the country, the Qing dynasty, was governed chiefly by another nomadic horse people. How is this possible? How could China be conquered by a population much smaller than its own if it had previously spent thousands of years perfecting these people's only advantage, the horse? Well, unfortunately for the various Chinese dynasties, China's soils are quite poor in selenium, a metal necessary for horse bone development. As such, Chinese horses were often frail and weak and had high mortality rates in military settings. This is actually really crazy to think about in the modern day. A slightly lower concentration of an already trace metal resulted in the most populous country in the world falling to small bands of nomads multiple times in its history. This setup would happen numerous times in history, like in the example of the Spanish conquistadors. Small groups of only a few hundred of them were able to conquer Amerindian civilizations of millions of people, while losing very few men in the process, partially due to how horrified and in awe of horses the local populations were. The Spaniards knew and took advantage of this, and, as Timothy Winegard mentions in The Horse, A Galloping History of Humanity, would add bells to their horses to make them more intimidating and would actively spread rumors about horses being magical in some way. Some of the rumors documented amongst the various Amerindian societies include that horses had feet made of silver, that horses could talk, and that horses were demons. I already mentioned that the horse went extinct in the Americas, whereas it survived in Eurasia, catapulting Eurasian civilizations with an enormous advantage over their competitors. But the horse just barely survived in Eurasia, and in fact, at its lowest point, the horse was hanging on to existence with maybe a few thousand individuals roaming the most remote plains of Eurasia. How could this narrow survival occur in Eurasia, but not in the New World? Well, there are a few potential factors. Firstly, Eurasia's major horse-friendly environment, the steppe, is much larger than the Americas' major horse-friendly environments, the Great Plains and the Pampas, with the Eurasian steppe occupying roughly 3 million square miles of land, compared to the Great Plains' 1.1 million square miles and the Pampas' 500,000 square miles. Moreover, Eurasia's steppe extends far more laterally than vertically, whereas both the Great Plains and the Pampas are the opposite, being rather north-south in orientation. It's possible that this made it easier for specific horse populations to escape hunting in Eurasia versus the New World, as places with similar latitudes tend to have more similar environments than places with similar longitudes. Additionally, we previously discussed the potential existence of human-fearing genes in animals common to both the New World and the Old World. Maybe New World horses just had slightly fewer of these genes in their pool, just barely missing the threshold of human fearing required to stave off extinction in the Americas. Neither of these theories are super strong, however, and honestly, it is very possible that horses survived in Eurasia but not in the Americas out of pure luck. A really bad case of luck for the inhabitants of the New World, but luck nonetheless. Regardless of the cause, Timothy Winegard mentions how the European return of the horse to the Americas, this time domesticated, brought insane changes to the cultural landscape of the Native Americans, with the Great Plains Native Americans becoming far more warlike, patriarchal, and even polygamous after attaining the horse. Massive social changes, especially when you consider that these happened mere decades after the horse's reintroduction. Interestingly enough, though, the horse doesn't always seem to bring about gender inequality. The Scythians, a long-feared horse-riding people, were famously egalitarian and even promoted many women to high and prestigious military ranks. This might be because practically everyone in Scythian society engaged in equestrianism, and the society seemingly developed from horse riding, whereas Native Americans, one, did not have enough horses for everyone to own one, and thus discriminated from the start, and two, had established cultures far predating the arrival of the horse. Whatever the social patterns, the horse clearly left an immense mark on the societies that were able to attain it, with many societies orienting their entire lifestyle and existence around horses, particularly nomadic ones. This brings us to our next section, Part 4, where nomadism wins. In the previous section, we saw how a country as massive as China could be ravaged by comparatively very small nomadic groups. But these groups were not able to exert massive cultural influence. In fact, the nomad-initiated Qing dynasty was almost entirely Han in its culture and polity, with the nomads themselves, the Manchu, becoming heavily Sinicized over the centuries until the modern day, where while their ethnic numbers are in the tens of millions, there are only a few hundred Manchus capable of speaking their native language. Interestingly enough, China is not unique in this regard, as this temporary nomad strength but long-term nomad irrelevance has occurred before. One of the most famous and resented events in history was the fall of the Roman Empire, usually blamed on barbarian and nomadic invasions. For so many years, I used to wonder how these groups were able to destroy such a large, powerful, and globally vital empire, until I took perhaps my favorite course yet at Princeton, HIS 343, The Formation of the Christian West. In this course, we focused heavily on Peter Brown's work, The Rise of Western Christendom. Throughout this book, Brown builds an increasingly unavoidable conclusion. The Roman Empire, at least the Western Roman Empire, didn't really fall. More so, it transformed into various empires in and around Western Europe. And while it is true that the various nomadic and barbarian groups were able to overpower Rome militarily, they largely were not able to supplant it culturally. The barbarians increasingly became Romanized until they were a large portion of the Roman elite. In fact, the ruling families and nobility of the various post-Roman kingdoms, most notably the Franks, were either very heavily intertwined with or directly from the ancient Roman nobility. Roman culture was so pervasive that multiple languages derived from Latin exist today. You had a country formally recognized as the Holy Roman Empire by the Catholic Church for centuries after the formal fall of Rome, and classical education remains widespread today, with even Latin being a relatively common language to learn in high school, and one that was compulsory in Western education up until a few decades ago. Meanwhile, the nomadic groups, while fearsome ravagers, were never able to maintain long-term control over conquered portions of the Roman Empire, with Attila the Hun's famous attempts only lasting a few years. After these attempts at nomadic dominance of the empire, the nomads' identities and civilizations largely faded away, and did so to such an extent that we have a hard time tracking down who exactly the descendants of the Huns are today, with no known linguistic or major cultural depositions. This was one of the most satisfying conclusions I've ever come upon, and honestly inspired in me a lot of the interest in history that brought me to making both this channel and video, so thank you, Professor Reimitz. But back to Rome. I specified that the Western Roman Empire survived. Great. But what happened to the Eastern Roman Empire? An empire largely centered around the Middle East. Unfortunately for the Eastern Romans, more popularly known today as the Byzantines, their society was genuinely invaded and conquered, being gradually eroded by the Islamic civilization on its southern and eastern edges for centuries until its full-blown extinction in 1453. What survived of Greece into the modern day could maybe be argued as a successor of the Byzantines, but even then, Greece only has 10 million people and very little geopolitical influence in the modern day. Even Byzantine religion, Eastern Orthodoxy, largely became a religion of the nations it occupies instead of a religion of a united classical civilization. Meanwhile, the nomadic conquerors of the Byzantines, firstly and chiefly the Arabs, but then later various Turkic groups, completely rewrote the society of the conquered areas in their image, with their religion, Islam, culture, particularly the Arabic language, and nobility almost completely replacing the Byzantine past of these lands. The nomads of the Middle East and North Africa were not mere sporadic ravagers like the Huns. They were a permanent society fully able to replace the Byzantines. So what gives? Why did the nomads succeed in ruling over the Near East and not Europe? This topic actually holds tremendous personal importance for me, as my ancestors, as well as the ancestors of most of the Greek Orthodox minority of the Middle East, largely come from the urbanite Byzantine Greeks and Greekified Levantines loyal to the Byzantine Empire. As such, the topic has always been kind of embittering for me, and so I actually decided to write my final paper for Reimitz's class on this topic. Essentially, the Middle East's geography is quite favoring of nomads. The Middle East has only a small band of arable land straddling vast deserts. Settled agriculturalists usually have a lot higher population densities than nomads, so if you have two plots of the same area, one with nomads and one with settled farmers, you can expect the plot with settled farmers to have a lot more people. But the sparseness of farmable land combined with the vastness of the nomad lands in the Middle East made the competition a lot closer, with nomads and settled groups having roughly similar population sizes. This effect was increased by the long-term turmoil in the region caused by the last installment of the centuries-long Roman-Persian Wars, specifically the Byzantine-Sassanian War of 602 through 628. This war was simply devastating on the region, and while the Byzantines did eventually win, they were gravely weakened by the effort they put in for their victory. Entire regions of settled farmers were depopulated and either perished or were taken captive, drastically reducing the populations that would resist cultural incursion from the Arab nomads and leaving both the Byzantines and the Persians too weak to effectively defend their own territories. These conditions all seem to surpass some critical mass, and by the rise of the caliphates, the Middle East was fully primed for a nomadic takeover. Meanwhile, the nomads stood no chance in Europe. Virtually all of Europe is farmable land, so the settled Europeans had drastically higher populations than the nomads. The nomadic Muslim conquerors of the Indian subcontinent, the Mughals, encountered a similar issue, as there were simply too many people to just supplant the culture of the populace, and so even over multiple centuries, even Indian/South Asian Muslims remained distinctly Desi in their culture and language. Anywhere where nomad-favoring lands are the same size or smaller than agriculturalist-favoring lands, the agriculturalists are able to maintain power through sheer numbers. The rule, then, is relatively simple. In the long term, nomadism only works in the places where farming doesn't work. Otherwise, a settled agricultural group eventually overpowers the nomads, since nomads have far lower population densities, as we saw an example of in section 2.3 with Russia. This argument can be made even more scientific by considering two basic principles. One, that for each niche up the food pyramid you go, you can only sustain about 1/10 of the biomass, since the rest is wasted in digestion, reproduction, and maturation. So, for example, for each pound of beef you want, you need roughly 10 pounds of grain and hay, whereas you could just eat those 10 pounds of grain yourself. The second principle is similar to the tragedy of the commons, in that nomads can't really take full advantage of their grazing lands. Conflicts between nomads would ensue because it's practically impossible to maintain optimum grazing conditions, particularly before modern coordination techniques and pastured fencing. If you try to graze too close to capacity, you very quickly run into overgrazing in certain areas, which would cause conflict between individual nomads. So nomads naturally need some distance from each other. Both of these principles have the effect of making nomadic populations much more sparse than settled populations, even in the most lush grazing lands. And the second point in particular also produces a rather strong and particular strain of individualism in nomadic societies. There's even a famous Bedouin saying about this which goes, "I am against my brother and I are against my cousin, and my cousin and I are against the stranger." A lack of a clear rule of law, which nomadic areas are almost coterminous with, produces a hostile and independent society, which brings us to our next ecological consideration. Part 5. Ecology and Temperament/Behavior. We know that ecology has a concrete effect on human behavior in certain ways. For example, in human language, where tonal languages, i.e. languages where the way you say a word affects its meaning, such as Cantonese or various Mesoamerican languages like Mayan, are highly concentrated in the humid tropical areas where your vocal cords are constantly moist and thus have an easier time making the sing-songy tones. Personally, I believe the effects go even deeper than just shallow effects like linguistics, that our natural environment can influence our temperament itself. We've actually already seen two instances of this. Firstly, with heat-depressing work ethic, and secondly, with nomadism increasing individualism. I also have a more fun example, though, based on a rather personal anecdote. For reference, my family and I come from the Syrian coastal mountains, from a small and relatively picturesque resort town popularly frequented by Syria's upper class as well as regional foreign travelers. One of my aunts ended up marrying a man from Syria's Far East, a conflict-prone area that was once a hub of insurgency and remains one of the most fanatical areas in Syria. She hated being there almost as much as she hated her husband's family, and she often remarked to us that the people there were all vicious and heartless. She did have a few friends, though, and I remember her telling us the one time that she was frustrated and asked one of these friends why the people of this part of Syria are so hostile. The friend responded that in my aunt's hometown, she awakes to a pleasant mountain breeze with picturesque views, whereas the people of far eastern Syria wake up to 100-degree weather and a sandstorm blowing in their eyes and nose. While this was a fairly light-hearted response, and my aunt's contempt for this region's inhabitants likely has a lot of bias attached to it, it reminded me of something I read all the way back in elementary school. In the book Chung Li and the Silk Road Caravan, where one of the caravan drivers mentions that camels are nothing like donkeys, instead they're far more vicious and unforgiving. I think it's entirely possible that the temperament of a human being can be affected by our environment just as much as the temperament of a camel. In a hot, dry, resource-poor region of the world, life is too vicious to not be shaped by it, particularly since humans are not that different from each other genetically, and so the genetic adaptations to deal with such hostile weather are not always very pronounced or effective, although I do have to say I am thankful for the nose shape such an environment gave me. So now we've seen how a nomad-preferring environment can produce strong individualism and independence in the nomads that inhabit it. But there is another notable example of a geographic people group shaped by their environment to a culture of fierce independence. Mountain people. Mountain people across the world are typically noted for their fierce independence and individualism, and, in fact, a lot of the traditional American values, particularly a lot of the traditional Southern American values, actually come from the cultures of the Scots-Irish who settled Appalachia, who again emphasized independence and family ties. I would argue that the Scots-Irish culture was itself heavily shaped by the fractured geography of both lowland and upland Scotland, and that these traits are universal enough in so many montane groups that in general mountain people tend to be more independent/individualistic because their geography afforded them very defended separation from their neighbors. The mountain terrain provides a very solid defense against trespassers, both individuals and armies who often struggle to gain military supply chains through the harsh terrain. This enabled mountaineers to historically live a life of greater independence from their larger geographic communities and the states that tried to govern said communities. This separation thus also helps to explain why mountain regions tend to be so culturally, linguistically, and genetically diverse, and why they tend to be hubs of insurgency, like the Caucasian mountains have been for the various empires that have sought to control them. Part 6. Ecology and Philosophy. The effects of ecology on philosophy can be more immediate and logistical, like how Greek culture and notably Greek philosophy only really spread in ancient times to areas where Alexander the Great and other Greek conquerors could feasibly colonize and establish centers of Greek learning. These conquerable areas for the Greeks were really only the areas which were relatively similar to the Greek climate. Other environments repeatedly proved too challenging for the Greeks to establish in. In Alexander the Great's case, his most famous failure was India. Upon getting to India, Alexander's army struggled against its alien environment, and so they eventually just gave up and left, failing to leave a lasting effect on the subcontinent. This idea can be expanded to other societies as well, and in general, philosophies historically only spread as far as the civilizations that invented these philosophies could reach. The situation can become more interesting, however, with more abstract cause-effect relationships between ecology and philosophy being possible, as most famously constructed in Oswald Spengler's seminal work, The Decline of the West. In The Decline of the West, Spengler broke up the world into 8 main high societies, with each one having a prime symbol, and each prime symbol having a geographic origin unique to the society it arose in. The rationale behind such correlations is quite simple. Basically, all abstract ideas and thoughts are dependent on real-world origins. Similarly to how computers can't truly produce random numbers, our brains can't truly produce abstract thoughts, and instead rely on the contortion of real-world stimuli into newer forms. This is the same reason as why when you ask people to think of a tool in color, most people, or at least more people than a truly random system would produce, think of a red hammer. Thus, when the great thinkers of each high society produced the philosophies that governed them, they were largely influenced by the environments around them. The ancient Egyptians saw a singular narrow river valley extending up and down the north-south axis, giving them a natural path to orient their lives around and make their analogies and myths from. The Mayans saw a hostile jungle, one that would constantly consume lands that were left alone, and so decided to produce an ideology of a cyclically apocalyptic universe. Similar abstractions can be suggested about other societies that Spengler didn't talk about, like how Polynesian society is based around the ever-expansive sea. But regardless of the application, the idea of our most abstract thoughts being based on our physical environment is a pretty sound one. These ecological effects on philosophy can also affect philosophy's applications, particularly one of its most studied and modernly relevant applications, governance. It's pretty evident how dominant Europe became as soon as it decided to send its ships across the world, building trade networks, colonies, and overpowering entire continents with its superior naval power and dynamic capitalist system that heavily protected the intellectual property of individuals and the right to enterprise, allowing them to innovate and conquer their way to global hegemony. But Europe wasn't the only one with such potential. China could have taken over the world via ships, and in fact, it could have beaten Europe to the game by at least 100 years, as China was ready for naval conquest of the world by at least the Ming Dynasty in the early 1400s. But it just decided not to. The Ming Dynasty started sending out exploratory voyages, called treasure voyages, in 1403 under the Yongle Emperor. The emperor assigned control of the treasure fleets to the imperial eunuchs, whose own power was extremely dependent on how much the emperor at the time liked them. The eunuchs were in fierce opposition to the civil officials of China's bureaucratic system, and so the treasure voyages were seen by the civil bureaucrats as an extension of eunuch power that needed to be destroyed. The civil officials began gaining the upper hand against the eunuchs after the initiator of the treasure fleet, the Yongle Emperor, died and his successors grew more wary of the eunuchs. With their upper hand, the civil officials decided to dismantle the treasure fleet system. In fact, later Chinese officials tried to erase documentation of both the treasure fleets as a whole and their most famous exploratory sailor, Zheng He. Also, even when China was sending its ships abroad, it wasn't using these ships for profit or war. It just used them to show off and to try to intimidate other nations. With their name, treasure fleets, being derived from the fact that China filled these ships with treasures before sending them out to impress foreigners. In essence, then, it's very reasonable to conclude that China's potential for global domination got lost in some sort of a bureaucratic nightmare. So, how did this bureaucracy arise? Jared Diamond, in Guns, Germs, and Steel, would again argue that this is due to ecological factors. He argued that China's geography allowed it to be isolated and united enough that it could conduct pretty brash strategies that would make no sense in a society surrounded by conflict and competition. He compares this bureaucratic Chinese system to the industriousness of Europe, whose many peninsulas and mountain ranges supposedly divvied up its land enough for it to have many small competing states whose individual desires for conquest required all states to innovate hard and act rationally in order to survive, which propelled European powers to unprecedented levels of innovation and global expansion. I think his argument requires some qualifying, however, as on paper, China is actually more geographically splintered than Europe, with mountains dominating its landscape and many small montane ethnic groups and subgroups of Han Chinese populating its hard-to-unify south. Meanwhile, most of Europe is a flat plain barely broken up by the Alps, Pyrenees, and Carpathian mountain ranges, with armies having a relatively easy time traversing its flat landmass. Thus, his argument requires a little more nuance to understand. Essentially, China is centralized because its agriculture, and thus civilization, began in its large central plains, which, when farmed, produced a large enough army to overpower and culturally assimilate all smaller Chinese states to its west and south. Meanwhile, Europe's societies began in its peninsular montane south, with its northern plains remaining hunter-gatherer areas for thousands of years longer, giving its large northern plains a disadvantage up until the late Roman period and even well into the Byzantine era. Thus, the people of Europe's large plains had thousands of years less time to dominate the entire continent, and honestly some of them were not that far off by the modern period either. For example, without the drop in fertility rates that industrialization brought them, the Germans could have very easily continued to colonize and conquer Europe's east as they had been doing for the last few centuries. If industrialization was delayed another 200 to 300 years in Europe, Germans could have very well emerged a supermajority in Europe, occupying a similar position to the Han Chinese of China. There is another crucial factor I'd like to add to China's ecology: rice. Rice is the only staple crop that can survive being flooded, which drastically improves yield as the flooding kills off weeds that would compete with the rice crops. So, very quickly, rice farming societies developed very complex irrigation systems to be able to flood all of their fields. Additionally, rice farming is very calorically efficient, producing multiple times more calories than wheat per acre. So, rice farming societies naturally supported more people per area. These two conditions, complex irrigation systems and a much denser population, required rice farming societies to be more cooperative than other agricultural societies, which over time produced highly effective collectivist societies, and when extended to states that oversee millions of people, produces a bureaucratic system designed to keep everyone happy and not disturb the status quo. China was heavily reliant on rice since its inception, and so this collectivism gradually got imparted on it. We even see evidence for this in the greater individualism found in the areas of China that don't farm as much rice, the colder, drier north, where Chinese farmers were historically far more reliant on wheat and in ancient times millet. This is also probably a good time to rephrase my initial point from the prologue of this video that I am not really trying to argue that different societies succeed or fail because of certain qualities of their people, or even that said societies are necessarily objectively better or worse than each other, as there are many ways to view and orient the actions of any society into a more or less moral lens. I mention this because for those of you who go digging into this subject further, it is possible that you will come across more controversial theories. There's even some evidence that complicated irrigation networks in East Asia had long-term effects via resulting in drastically lower prevalences of risk-taking genes in East Asia's populace. Since essentially if one guy decides to veer off the communal consensus on some irrigation experiment or whatnot, he could potentially destroy the crop yields for thousands of others and result in mass starvation, weeding out more riotous communities. However, as I mentioned, this theory is both really controversial for obvious reasons and not fully agreed upon by anthropologists. Such topics can thus unfortunately turn really nasty, which would kind of destroy the purpose of trying to understand the world in a constructive and cooperative way. Also, my point in making this video isn't really to make any racial or human genetic commentary, and I will admit I feel really out of my element with such commentary. That being said, however, I will not totally deny the potential long-term effects of ecology on human genetics. After all, we already have multiple more concrete and less controversial examples of this, most notably sickle cell anemia being far more common in sub-Saharan Africa as an adaptation against certain strains of malaria, and even human genetic divergence in these adaptations, with two longtime alpine peoples, native Andeans and native Tibetans, having different genetic adaptations to handle their low oxygen environments, with native Andeans having more hemoglobin in their blood and native Tibetans having a handful of mutations that facilitate more efficient oxygen transport to cells, among other mutations these cultures exhibit. Part 7, Ecology and Religion. This is a really rich subject, and it really should be its own standalone video, but for now I'm just going to leave it as a part of our greater study of and journey into ecology. Naturally, this is also a loaded and potentially very incendiary topic, so please take everything I say with a grain of salt. 7.1. Ecology and Religious Outlook on Life. I would argue that this is the most second-order effect in this entire video, as religious ideologies are largely dependent on the philosophies of the civilizations they form in, which themselves are largely dependent on the ecologies of and environments around these civilizations. For this, I'm going to group the main global faiths into three categories: Middle Eastern-derived religions, East and South Asian-derived religions, and animistic faiths. Obviously, this is a gross oversimplification, and there's a lot more nuance to global religion than can be contained in three categories. But for the purpose of not making this a 10-hour video, this categorization will do. The Middle East's religions have easily been the most impactful on a global scale, and the ones most adaptable to different regional customs and cultures, particularly Christianity and Islam, who together compose roughly 60% of the global population, and even more if you include cultural Christians and Muslims. Moreover, this global spread is baked into many of these religions' ideologies, with Christianity and Islam being well known as some of the most universalist religions in the world. But even smaller Middle Eastern religions like Judaism or Zoroastrianism experience strong universalism, or at least have a thorough outlook to civilizations alien to the ones they developed in. I would argue that this isn't a coincidence, and that the Middle East's religions are more universal because they had to develop in a place where multiple societies were constantly at war. A place where even multiple ways of life were constantly at war, with the large deserts of the Middle East providing a safe harbor for nomads who would constantly invade and ravage the settled farming regions. Religion is largely a method of making peace with the world around us, and so the Middle East's religions had to make peace with constant war and competing civilizations. Opposing the competing and warring civilizations of the Middle East are the highly stable and bureaucratic civilizations of East and South Asia. These civilizations produced religions like Buddhism, Confucianism, and Hinduism, which all emphasize making peace with the stable universe around us. These religions came about in societies that were so sturdy, powerful, and bureaucratic that the systems these civilizations espoused and the interactions people had on the day-to-day were treated as a given, something unmovable. But obviously, no one has a perfect day, and so if the world around you is unchangeable, you have to come up with a proper rationalization of how to make peace with the imperfections of day-to-day life and general civilizational groans. Each Eastern religion found its own peace with such a sturdy setup, but a common theme remains. You are part of a larger system that you must pay some level of reverence to, as you alone are minuscule compared to it. This Eastern focus on making peace with stability is why I think we saw so many New Age belief systems emerge in the latter half of the 20th century in America. The country was essentially homogeneous when you exclude its functionally segregated minority communities, and the population grew up believing that American hegemony would never fail, especially as the Soviet Union visibly declined. These 20th century generations, especially the boomers, grew up in an America that had not faced a real existential threat since the Civil War, and one that had increasingly subdued all its external threats, threats that the average American very rarely interacted with personally. And so the peace they had to make was not with conflict, it was with a system that was so strong that it didn't give them an outlet to excuse the imperfections of the world as a lack of civilizational control. Moreover, a lot of these hippies and New Age believers were from a comfortable upper middle class background, and so their lives were truly the epitome of stability of America's golden age. As America increasingly changed its fabric in all ways in these last 30 years, we've seen this idea of stability rapidly deteriorate, and with it, the New Age religions that shun an expansive bureaucratic society have rapidly declined in popularity. Contrary to bureaucracy, and in fact contrary to settled society as a whole, are the conditions which favor the rise of animism. Animism encapsulates the belief structures that still view humans as one of nature's ecological niches, frequently featuring a fear of the wild, awe at the power of nature, and belief in the existence of spirits in all components of nature, and just the general interconnectedness of nature. This belief structure does not separate humanity from the natural world, and as such, it is nearly universal in pre-agricultural societies, as well as societies that have only recently gained agriculture and thus have not had enough time to truly internalize their newly found control over natural elements. Animism is a massive grouping, however, and so I propose a main axis of differentiation based on how much each specific animistic faith emphasizes fear of the wild and how much it emphasizes the interconnectedness of nature. Animistic faiths in less aggressive environments, particularly environments where humans do not often get attacked by ambush predators or venomous animals, tend to value the interconnectedness of nature more than fear of it. Animistic faiths in more hostile environments, particularly those filled with ambush predators and venomous animals, more drastically so in jungles, value fear of the wild, or rather fear of the jungle, since that's the most hostile environment to humanity and one where a deadly animal could be mere feet away from you without you seeing it, more than the interconnectedness of nature. We have already seen a portion of this fear of the jungle in the previous section, Ecology and Philosophy, through one of Oswald Spengler's main civilizations, Mesoamerica. His explanation of its prime symbol, the jungle, struck me as a little lacking, however, due to just how brutal Mesoamerican societies were, featuring ritualistic sacrifices, ritualistic cannibalism, brutal, almost demonic wars, and just a really grave look on life where the apocalypse is impending and the gods are bloodthirsty. This puts Mesoamerican society in a special league of brutality, more brutal than other jungle-based civilizations like southern India or even Papua New Guinea. Could a further ecological factor cause this special brutality? This brings us to 7.2, Ecology and Myths. We've seen ecology heavily influencing multiple other aspects of the human experience, and those aspects were more primary than mythology, so it's very likely that many of our myths have ecological origins as well. To see some of these ecological origins, we will return to our motivating question on whether or not there was another ecological factor or factors in the brutality of Mesoamerican societies. Scholarly consensus points to yes. One of the biggest YouTubers in the civilizational commentary realm, What If Altist, explains a component of this in his video explaining native Mexican civilization. In the video, he credits severe drought and cyclic societal collapse as the chief drivers of the apocalyptic mindset of Mesoamerican societies, fluctuations potentially caused by El Niño. We saw similar explanations for the lack of civilization in pre-European Australia, but the difference here being that Central America is in a far higher energy environment with far more fertile soils than Australia, and a lot larger area of habitable farmable land than New Guinea, thus allowing Central America to develop complex and highly populated, albeit constrained, civilizations. He credits these fluctuations as causing periodic catastrophes that lead to the Mesoamerican societies developing apocalyptic worldviews. I found this point profound, and while I don't necessarily agree with all of his talking points, I think his channel is definitely worth checking out to see explanations of the world from a more anthropological lens. I would also add to his point that without beasts of burden, megafauna like horses and donkeys used for plowing and moving heavy objects, the average peasant worker would have to do a lot more labor for the same crop yields, and had less reassurance of surplus in the case of drought, as after all, you can't eat your horse when you're starved if you don't have a horse in the first place. Moreover, like we saw in the Melanesian and Polynesian cases, a lack of protein sources in a society often leads to prevalent cannibalism, and if you are routinely witnessing people, especially the priest and elite classes, routinely sacrificing and eating other people, it's less difficult to imagine a cruel, consuming universe as a whole. Moreover, I come from a very superstitious society myself, amongst what Spengler would classify as the Magians. Growing up, it was extremely common to see people themselves referred to as bad luck charms/bad omens, reviled by others for the supposed black cloud they bring with their presence. Witch hunts in Europe and early colonial America occupy the same mental space, where certain individuals are tautologically wicked and a source of spiritual despair for the society that contains them. In such an environment, and one as historically common as this, it's really not hard to see how a few additional stress factors could transform simple hatred and small-scale witch hunts into mass human sacrifices. Again, one could argue an ecological basis for these beliefs, with Spengler summarizing a really concise origin for my Middle Eastern background's superstitions based off of the root Magian society's desert cave environments. So ecology could very well seep into our myths as well. Again, I should bring up my point earlier about the Garden of Eden potentially being a societal memory of our distant hunter-gatherer past. There are more benign and minor examples, however, with one of my favorite being the potential origin of trolls and other humanoid cryptids in European folklore, Neanderthals. The brutish, stout, and pronounced look of Neanderthals, which itself was shaped by the brutally cold terrain that Neanderthals evolved in, would have likely struck the first Homo sapiens to encounter the Neanderthals as quite odd. Humans and Neanderthals went to war often, and so it's easy to see how those odd traits could have quickly transformed into indicators of fearsome woodland creatures in the minds of early Europeans. Over the millennia, the art could have been reduced to its abstraction, and with that, early European hunter-gatherer encounters with Neanderthals very well might have turned into modern children's bedtime stories about trolls. As an aside, those very same Neanderthal and other non-human hominid interactions could have resulted in something more primal than myth, a specific fear, or more accurately, the specific discomfort caused by the uncanny valley effect. The explanation is pretty simple. Over the history of our species, we've had more than enough time to cultivate an innate fear of other human species, which are the only things that would be able to track us down and hunt us the same way we hunt animals. There's also a possibility that the uncanny valley could be explained away by something even more obvious: corpses. Corpses are incredible disease vectors, and being in too much contact with them could very easily get a person really sick. Humans are curious and have urges, so this innate fear of something similar to, but not quite human, might have been a great way of repelling our ancestors from an early demise. Or maybe it's both the corpse and the hominid Neanderthal, and the effect is doubly strengthened. Regardless, I only mention this point about the uncanny valley because I keep seeing people theorize that it has a biological basis, and that this biological basis is because of something spooky like cryptids or aliens or whatever. No, it's because people who went and poked corpses got diseases, and or people that went and poked Neanderthals got beaten with a club, featuring such fearless people out of the gene pool. We could make the same arguments about trypophobia resulting from various skin-affecting diseases, or a fear of aliens/dolls coming from a fear of unknown children, indicating unknown and thus potentially dangerous adults nearby. Fears have a genetic programming. We even see evidence for ancient developments of myths for the purpose of ecological engineering. Ironically enough, we see this emerge in a society many would dismiss as primitive: Aboriginal Australia, specifically the concept of story places. Story places were sacred areas in Aboriginal culture where hunting or even basic human trespassing were strictly discouraged. Early European academics were confused by the concept, not sure where the myth came from. Going back to The Future Eaters by Tim Flannery, however, reveals a really crucial purpose in these story places. They acted as a culturally encoded nature reserve, one where animal populations, specifically various species of tree kangaroo that were a vital protein source for the Aboriginals, could recover enough to repopulate the areas Aboriginals did allow themselves to hunt, keeping Aboriginal societies from starving, particularly in the long term. In fact, these story places were found to contain animals locally extirpated in other areas during later European colonization. 7.3. Ecology and religious dietary restrictions. Outside of the sheer technological primitiveness of the culture there, one of the most shocking things to the early European explorers who encountered Tasmania was the fact that on a small island surrounded by seas full of fish, the entire population refused to eat fish, and in fact reviled when they saw Europeans eating fish. What's even weirder is that the people there weren't wealthy enough to particularly afford this dietary restriction, as the society was too small and isolated to develop ways to attain and process any potential surplus of land resources. And in fact, the Aboriginal Tasmanians lacked clothing despite Tasmania's cold climate, and even forgot how to produce fire, and if theirs went out, they had to go to the nearest tribe, even an enemy tribe, to get their fire from them. They even had a custom around this fire getting, where all hostilities would be paused until the tribe seeking fire got it. So these people were barely holding on to survival, and yet completely shirked the major bounties within their coastal waters. How could this happen? How could such a fish-ready population shun their most opportune food source? In The Future Eaters, Tim Flannery postulates a rather interesting explanation for this: poisonous algae blooms. Occasionally, a type of algae known as dinoflagellate blooms and produces a phenomenon known as a red tide. These red tides poison both the fish in the oceanic food chain and the people eating said fish, killing a high percentage of those who eat the fish. In most parts of the world, these red tides would only kill a minuscule portion of the population, a few hundred perhaps. But pre-European Tasmania's population was no more than a few thousand, so a few hundred people dying would have been a major catastrophe, and it would only need to happen a few times before the people of Tasmania would develop a concrete taboo of eating fish. I couldn't find a modern parallel because of how small Tasmania's population was, but for reference, think of mad cow disease, but unpredictable and untreatable, and also killing 10% of the population. We would quickly stop eating beef in such conditions. So we can assume at least some of the food restrictions in the world are due to mass poisonings. Such poisonings could have not possibly been large or unpredictable enough to initiate dietary restrictions in places like the Middle East, though, where multiple religions came up with a ban on pork. What can be attributed to this pork-eating taboo then? We again look to ecology. The Middle East's agricultural lands are rather sensitive to abrupt changes. There's just not enough water for ecosystems there to quickly recover from things like overgrazing or deforestation. Pigs are rooting animals, meaning they dig through soil and eat the roots of plants. In sensitive ecosystems, like many in the Middle East, This would have quickly led to ecological catastrophe and desertification. Moreover, pigs like to wallow in mud and water, which is great for places where rainfall is high and water plenty, since any water sources that pigs contaminated would quickly be replenished, and even if there weren't, there'd be plenty of other water sources to drink from. In the Middle East, the situation is far less forgiving, and it would be very easy for a pig-raising Middle Eastern community to have all of its water resources contaminated for long enough to cause significant communal issues. Finally, for some reason, the people of the Middle East experience pork allergies at a higher rate than in other places in the world. And while that may be due to them not eating pork, so pork allergies wouldn't really have negative selection pressure against them, it may also be that a few tribal chiefs or religious leaders had these allergies, gotten sick from eating pork, and issued a religious/cultural edict to ban pork. On the other hand, places that can sustainably support pig farming tend to love pork. And in fact, globally, these places eat so much pork that they offset the pork restrictions of Muslims and Jews, enough for pork to be the most commonly consumed meat, despite a full quarter of the world not consuming it. This has actually historically been a constraint for Islam, and if you overlap the areas where Islam is common in the world to the semi-arid to arid regions of the Old World, you see a very high correlation. If you are in an area where pig farming is feasible and you own pigs, it would often just not make enough sense to join a religion that would cause you to lose your source of income and lose a key part of your culture and cuisine. Even if you are made to pay an Islamic poll tax, you would likely still make more money paying the tax and raising pigs than converting to Islam and losing your source of income. Additionally, places with naturally high feral hog populations have been difficult for Muslim communities to break into, most notably West Papua in Indonesia. Here, Indonesia has actively been trying to populate the region with Muslim settlers to offset the predominantly Christian indigenous population. Their attempts have had limited success, however, partially due to resistance from the Papuan natives, but also due to how common feral hogs are here. Papuan natives reduce their numbers by just hunting and eating the wild pigs, whereas Indonesian Muslims largely leave them alone, and in turn, pig populations in the Muslim portions of Papua are left to explode, ravaging Muslim farms. I mentioned that Islam tends to do well in semi-arid areas, but I also just mentioned that there are Muslims in tropical, humid Indonesia, and in fact, Indonesia has either the first or second highest Muslim population in the world. How is this possible? Well, there are two notable exceptions to the Islamic climate correlation. South Asia, especially Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Indonesia. Pigs can thrive in both of these climates, so why do the populations not eat pork? And in fact, pre-Muslim Indonesians often did eat pork, so how did the Islamic missionaries convince them to stop? The key here lies in two other religions, Buddhism and Hinduism. Essentially, both East Asia and South Asia have a long history of practicing Hinduism and Buddhism, religions that both preach vegetarianism, so the idea of cutting out a source of meat was not only familiar to these populations, it was honorable. This made it easier for South and Southeast Asians to have a restricted diet, and so pork could more easily be done away with here. Moreover, Indonesia and Bangladesh also have heavily fish-based diets, so pork was not their main protein source like it is in most of China or certain parts of Europe. As for why Hinduism and Buddhism preach vegetarianism, it could be a result of the more spanning ecological factors that Oswald Spengler discussed, or it could be simply logistical, similar to the story places we saw earlier. Many Buddhist cultures view eating beef as a taboo because cows were too important in their societies for rice farming, especially since Buddhist lands don't tend to have a lot of arable land because of how dense of populations rice farming allows, whereas cattle ranching historically requires far more sparse populations. We have seen a parallel of this earlier with horse-eating taboos in other agrarian societies like Europe that we mentioned in Part 3, and in fact there were even religious edicts against eating horse meat there, with Gregory III famously outlawing its consumption. Part 8. Consequences of ecological flux/climactic change. We've already mentioned how drought could have caused apocalyptic thinking in Mesoamerica, but it could have also caused a more tangible effect, conflict. During times of drought, resources are often constrained enough to cause peaceful neighboring states to go to war against each other, and this certainly occurred in Central America. In fact, these drought-related conflicts likely both preceded and caused the apocalyptic thinking of Central American civilizations, as many collapses of specific civilizations in this region correspond with geological record of droughts here, and these droughts happened cyclically enough that such phenomena eventually became encoded into the religion and philosophy of the Mesoamerican. But Mesoamerica is not the only place where drought-based conflict has occurred, and such drought-based conflicts are not just a thing of the past, as evidenced by a particularly modern example. Right before its civil war, meaning in the years 2006 through 2011, Syria experienced one of the worst droughts on record, and in fact the worst drought in over 900 years. This drought displaced almost 2 million people, that is almost 10% of Syria's population, from their farmlands to a life of poverty in Syria's already overcrowded cities. These people were also largely underprivileged and poorly educated, and now with nothing to lose, they were the perfect kindling for the start of Syria's war. The violence erupted soon after this mass displacement, and the correlation has been so stark that it is common academic opinion that this 2006 through 2011 drought was a major causal factor in Syria's war. It might be important here to clarify how the Middle East can avoid the apocalyptic thinking of the Mesoamericans if populations here also seem to experience drought-related conflict, at least sometimes. Well, while the Middle East does have droughts, and pretty devastating ones at that, the Middle East has far fewer cyclicity to its droughts because it lacks the El Niño effect. So droughts here didn't happen regularly enough to be associated with an apocalyptic calendar. Also, Middle Eastern societies have had far longer to develop culturally, and so have had more time to develop a more nuanced philosophy than just apocalyptic thought. Finally, unlike Mesoamerica, the Middle East has beasts of burden to aid in producing more food abundance to store for times of drought, and in the worst case, the populations here could just eat the family mule, so the region has historically had very little need for starvation-induced cannibalism. Without common occurrences of cannibalism, the horrors the average Middle Eastern experienced in their life was just that much lower than the horrors the average Mesoamerican experienced in their life, giving people in the Middle East a little more peace of mind than the people of Mesoamerica. So climate change has previously had an effect on societal development globally. I, as well as pretty much every professional academic interested in this subject, would argue that modern climate change will see similar social upheavals. But this topic will require a video of its own, and there's also enough buzz out there about climate change right now that I don't feel like I'm being too original in including it in a video about intriguing cases of ecology affecting civilization. Regardless, however, ecological flux clearly has an effect on society. This also goes the other way, meaning that society also has an effect on ecological flux. Again, this is evident to us now because of the impacts of industrialization on modern climate change, but there are much older examples as well. We even have evidence that human-caused climate change, similar to today, could have been occurring in the era where humanity's agricultural civilizations rapidly arose, so from roughly 9,000 to 6,000 years ago, as we have evidence of large-scale, human-caused environmental disruption at this time via deforestation, agriculture, and irrigation networks, and even the desertification of fragile grasslands in Arabia by sheep overgrazing. This period, by the way, is thought to have led to the development of the first literate societies, Egypt and Sumer, by constricting their population's arable land territory via the desertification of the Sahara and Arabia, respectively, similar to how agriculture and the first civilizations in the Middle East likely arose from the arable land constrictions caused by the Younger Dryas climate event, which we discussed in part 1 of this video. Humanity has had more than just climactic effects on global ecology, however. Even the soil chemistry of vast regions have been indirectly affected by human actions for thousands of years. Most notably, the Amazon basin is thought to be nutrient poor partially because of humans extincting the megafauna there that fertilized this region thousands of years ago. On that note, this is also why I very much so support leaving Escobar's hippos alone. Tropical South America has been lacking large animals since the last ice age, so these hippos might be able to revitalize the missing niche in these ecosystems. This wouldn't be the first time an invasive species has revitalized an ecosystem. We saw the same phenomenon arising in the grassland pampas region of South America with the post-Columbus arrival of the horse, and in Australia with the arrival of the sheep. Actually, in many of the regions where Europeans took over, European organisms tended to thrive and take over, whereas very few colonial organisms managed to establish themselves in Europe. In Ecological Imperialism, Alfred Crosby postulates that this might be due to the fact that Europe transplanted whole ecosystems into its colonies, with its many invasive plants, animals, and bacteria often interdependent on each other for their success, whereas it only brought back isolated species from its colonies that lacked the other organisms they depended on. Moreover, Europe has an overabundance of weeds because of how heavily Europeans have been farming its lands, and weeds are able to establish themselves as a foundational species very easily, with other European organisms literally growing off of the success of these weeds. Finally, there is a period from 1500 to 1850 AD that was known as the Little Ice Age, which resulted from the opposite change. Human carbon emissions had actually decreased during this time, largely due to the ridiculously high death rates caused by the Eurasian invasions of Genghis Khan, the bubonic plague in Europe and the Middle East, and the death of the vast majority of the New World's population of roughly 50 million from diseases spread through European contact. These three events, happening in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, respectively, destroyed so many societies that humans, for a short and rare window in their history, were actually regressing in how much they controlled the world. Part 9. Limits of Ecological Determinism. Obviously, as with any theory encompassing all of reality, there are limitations to how much it can actually be applied. In particular, it seems like ecological factors can't always account for everything, i.e., there seems to be a level of randomness to the outcomes of society. We actually already implied this in our discussion in Part 3 about horses. There seems to be an inherent luck factor to how horses evaded extinction in the Old World but not the New World. Such luck factors are logical, as currently even the most advanced theories place us in a stochastic, meaning probabilistic, universe, one where events are not fully predictable. There are other limits than just basic randomness as well. For instance, we see compounding factors potentially making the argument for ecological determinism weaker. We can look back at Part 8 for a counter-argument. Here we stated that drought was the main cause of the Syrian civil war, but Syria has another factor to consider. It is a rather ethno-religiously diverse country, and the cities that people displaced by the drought went to were its most diverse cities, stroking long-held tensions there. Similar tensions existed in Mesoamerica, with the region culturally quite diverse and its wars being largely fought between different city-states with different societies. Finally, it seems like our world is at least somewhat chronological. We already mentioned that humanity had to develop technology before it was ready to settle down and farm, but technological prerequisites also showed up later in the development of global civilization. This was perhaps most recently profound in the Europeans, who had to develop advanced sailing techniques before they could conquer and make use of the world as a whole. You see, Europeans weren't the most widely traveled sailors until really the modern period, as in from the 1400s onward. Before then, groups like the Polynesians and various Indian Ocean traders traveled across the oceans far more vigorously. But these groups had really favorable conditions to sail in. The Polynesians had the warm and reliable currents of the South Pacific, whereas the Indian Ocean traders had the extremely predictable wind and sea currents of the monsoon. The Atlantic Ocean was far less forgiving, and in fact it was so harsh that even legendary explorers struggled in navigating it. Christopher Columbus himself actually almost starved on his second voyage. So, before they could conquer the world, Europeans needed time to develop a range of complex sailing techniques and technologies. This in particular entails techniques like tacking, which allows you to sail against the wind direction, or the Portuguese perfected sailing technique of volta do mar, which allows sailors to take advantage of the cyclonic shape of global wind currents to be able to reliably sail both to and from their destination, or technologies like the chronometer, which is essentially just a clock, which allowed sailors to reliably be able to tell what longitude they were at for the first time in history. All of these technological prerequisites to European hegemony over the last 500 years suggest a time variable to how these ecological differences soak into the societies and the people that make up these societies. In fact, we can even question our initial assumption that Western European societies are the most successful, as in the long term, there seem to be periods that favor one ecology and then other periods that favor another ecology. And our assumption that the West's hegemony will continue unabated falsely assumes that Western society will continue into the future with perpetuity. Spengler mentions this societal lifespan with civilizations supposedly being cyclical. And while I don't agree with the cyclic nature, I do agree that societies have periods where their uniquenesses are most advantageous and others where their uniquenesses hold them back. Part 10. Future Changes. I've previously mentioned how technology has already allowed us to overcome ecological constraints. But what if technology will allow us to completely transform the ecology around us, even at its most macroscopic level, the atmosphere? This is frequently touted through the idea of cloud seeding, but it sees consistently limited success. I used to be interested in ecological engineering, and it led me into digging into climate engineering, and I quickly realized the reason that cloud seeding is largely ineffective is because cloud seeding projects are simply too localized to affect global rainfall patterns. Luckily, nature has provided us a great example of how to do climate engineering right. The Amazon rainforest. The Amazon is well over 1,000 miles inland and yet remains incredibly humid, which is strange because most global precipitation comes from oceanic water evaporation. How is this possible then? Well, it turns out that the word most, and not all, here is important in clarifying where global precipitation comes from. While yes, the oceans are largely responsible for global rain, which is why the wettest areas tend to be near the coast, plants also affect rainfall patterns through transpiration. In the Amazon's case, the forest likely began as a narrow band of dense forest near the South American coast, and gradually through heavy transpiration and winds blowing the water from this transpiration inwards into the continent, the Amazon began expanding from its coastal nursery. This process is so profound that it's even been given its own fun-sounding name, the biotic pump. If we can somehow recreate this biotic pump artificially, we could theoretically change rainfall patterns to suit our interests instead of the other way around. I would be scared for such technologies to fall in the hands of opposing nations, however, as it could quickly turn wars into ecological battles and cause massive famines and catastrophe. The second future change has to do with us colonizing planets outside of our solar system. This topic is really interesting, and I'm sure I'll make a video on it eventually, but for now I'll spare the details and give a summary. One of my favorite complaints about modern life is that everywhere on Earth worth mapping out has already been mapped out and discovered. So the Earth's frontiers are closed, and we are left without a way to satiate our innate human desire to explore and discover. Interstellar colonization would help soothe those desires, and might also give us enough land and isolation to revitalize our ancient hunter-gatherer ways and customs. Additionally, we have no clue if alien animals and plants will have all of the same amino acids as the organisms on Earth, and in particular, we would need to get really clever if an exoplanet lacked any of the 21 vital amino acids for human life and protein formation. However, there is some promising news on the matter, as one, many of these amino acids are really basic molecules, and two, we could likely figure out a genetically engineered approach to either ourselves or our gut bacteria if any planet we were on had drastically different enough biochemistry. In conclusion, through our winding path journey through history, societies, and the human experience as a whole, we have seen how ecology dictates, or at the very least heavily influences, human life, and the civilizations that act as a superposition of many human lives. If our arguments are unfalsifiable enough, this then feels like a full affirmation of our lack of free will, but such conclusions are for you all to reach individually.
All right, that's about all I have for you all today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please also stay on the lookout for part 2 of this video, which should come out pretty soon. Part 2 will have a very different tilt to it in terms of the factors within ecology that it considers. And then also, very especially, we'll only look at one civilization in particular. I won't say which civilization yet in order to not spoil the surprise. So I guess you'll just all have to wait and see. In return, I'll try to make you all not wait too long. But yeah, thank you again and see you soon.